So now that we have a shiny new Angular project, what we're going to do now is take a look at this inside VS Code and see what we were given when we created this particular project. So what I'm going to do is, rather than open up VS Code at this particular level, I'm just going to cd up into the parent directory, the dating app directory, and I'm just going to open up VS Code from this particular level. Because what I want to do is have both of my projects open in the same code editor, and it just makes it easy to work with them at the same time. Now, because I've opened this particular project, or both projects, at a higher level, and we've got the C# extension installed, then it's going to ask us if we want to add that .vs code folder we saw earlier on. Now, we don't need access to that at this level, and I've missed the opportunity to click the button saying don't ask again, but if you do see that, just click on the button to say don't ask me again. We've already got it inside our API folder. We don't need it at this particular level. And the only reason for opening up both projects in the same window is it just makes it convenient. We'll sometimes jump between different projects as we're building this application, and it just makes it easier to have them both available to work on at the same time. But that doesn't mean these projects have any relation to each other. They're completely separate. And there's no such concept when we're creating an application like this as to have a solution file where we can add a reference to our Angular project in. It's a completely different thing to our .NET Core project. And it's purely for convenience that we've got them both open in VS Code at the same time. So what we're going to do is take a look at our dating app -spar application and see what we've got inside here. Now we've got a whole bunch of different files inside here, and we'll take a look at some of them. And what we'll start with is this node modules folder. When we created our Angular app, it installed all of the dependencies it has for this particular application, and there are hundreds of dependencies that are listed inside node modules. Now, node modules is created based on the information that's contained inside the package.json file. If we clone this project and we move it onto another computer, then what we would typically do is not save our node modules folder into source control, and all of our dependencies can be recreated based on what's contained inside package.json. Now, we've got all of our dependencies in here, and these are all of our Angular dependencies, and also some additional libraries as well that Angular makes use of, such as RxJS, and we'll talk about this as we build our application. What we also have in here is some npm scripts. And this gives us access to commands that we can use to run our application. Now, if we were to type in npm start, then what npm start would do is call the ngserve command. And this is the command we use to run our Angular application. Now, typically, we'll just use ngserve to run our application rather than using the npm scripts. As I mentioned, we've got our Angular dependencies here. And we're on version 8 at the moment. And this particular lesson, because it's early in the course and just in case you're brand new to Angular, I'm just re-recording the ones that I'm updating to version 8 of this particular framework. Now, this course was originally created in version 4 and then updated for version 6. So you may see some inconsistencies between the videos as we build this application. Please don't worry if you're watching a video and you see my example of package.json, and instead of saying version 8, it says version 6. This means that the code that we write in that particular lesson hasn't changed at all based on the fact that we're now on version 8 of Angular. As much as I would love to re-record every single lesson to be consistent, it would take a very long time, and it would mean I would be able to update the course less frequently than I currently am. And even then, it's still difficult to keep up with the releases of Angular, because every 6 months they release a major version, although the concepts don't actually change so much. So we've got our dependencies, and then we've got our dev dependencies, and Angular uses TypeScript, and the version of TypeScript we're on at the moment is 3.5.3. Now, if you don't have TypeScript installed globally on your computer, it doesn't matter too much because you'll be using the local version of TypeScript that comes along with this package.json. So what we also have inside here is a source folder, and this contains all of our Angular code. And what we'll take a look at is briefly how the application starts and bootstraps itself, and what we get inside our project. And we'll start off with the most important file. I'll say they're all important, but this one especially is the fact that Angular has to have at least one file that's decorated with the ng module. And typically when we create our project, we'll have an app.module.ts, and it has the ng module decorator. Now, one of the jobs of this particular module is to bootstrap our Angular components, or one of them. And in this case, we have an app component. And if we take a look at the app component, which is also in this folder, then this is our root component that's being bootstrapped by our app module component. Now, any Angular component is decorated with the component that it gets from Angular core. And this is a decorator. And because Angular uses TypeScript, it uses decorators to give our components Angular features. So when we use a decorator of a component, that means our JavaScript class, or what would be a JavaScript class, is still a JavaScript class or a TypeScript class, but it has Angular features. And what we also specify inside this decorator is some configuration properties. It has a selector, in this case it's called app_root, and we use our selectors inside other component templates to show a child component on our page, for instance, and each component has a template URL. And it can also have a style URL to give this component some specific styling. Now, our component class, this file with the .ts extension, this is responsible for providing the data for our view. And the view of our component is in the component's HTML file. And if we take a look at this one, then what we can see here is just standard HTML, nothing else. And it is standard HTML, but there's one small difference that we can see inside here. And that's what's inside these curly braces. Now, this is what's referred to as interpolation. So the data that's provided from our component file in this component.ts, the only property our class has is the title. And I'm just going to change the title to app. But this is what's going to be replaced inside these curly braces. We're going to get the data, the property from our component, and display that instead of title on our page. Okay, so just to recap, we know that the app module bootstraps our app component, and we know our app component is an Angular class that provides data for our view, which is the app component HTML. And the next question is, well, okay, so what calls the app module component? What bootstraps this particular component? Well, what we also have in our solution here is a main.ts file. And inside here, we've got some bootstrap information about the module that we're going to bootstrap when we run our application. And in this case, we're using Platform Browser Dynamic because we're building a web application that uses a browser. We're using this particular method to then go ahead and bootstrap the module, and it's calling our app module class that we just looked at. So this is all well and good, but what are we displaying to the client? Because a client is not going to be able to call our app component.ts file, but what we're building here is a single page application, and a single page application has a single page. In this case, it's our index.html. Now what we see inside here is the app_root selector, and when we want to display an Angular component on a HTML page, we use its selector so that we can display the view of that particular component, and we can see the app_root inside here. And that corresponds with what's inside our app component TS, and it's this selector that's used on our index.html page to display this particular component. But if we go back to the index.html page, well, how is our index.html page supposed to know what to do with app_root? This is TypeScript that's providing the data for this particular component. How is this going to be displayed on our page? Because this on its own is not enough to display our Angular components. We need JavaScript to do that. And this is where a bit of magic happens behind the scenes that the Angular CLI tooling gave us. Behind the scenes, Angular CLI uses Webpack, which is a bundler, it's a minifier, and it compiles all of our code into JavaScript, and it also injects the JavaScript files into our index.html page. So even though we can't see them here whilst we're in development, when we run our application, our index.html file is going to have about 5 different JavaScript files that are responsible for providing the JavaScript that powers this particular view, or our index.html, which can then load up our Angular components. And whilst we don't have any access directly to the Webpack configuration, what we do have is an Angular.json file. And this allows us a sort of window into that configuration. And inside the options for our Angular JSON, what we have is a pointer to both our index.html page, where the JavaScript is going to be injected to, and we also have the main.ts file, which is the one that's responsible for bootstrapping our application as a whole. So we're not going to worry too much about what's going on inside the Angular.json file at the moment. We will come back to this later, because we will need to add things into this as and when we need to. But what we will do now is actually start our Angular application so we can take a look and see what we get when we run this. And what we can do is we can open up the terminal inside VS Code, so just Control and apostrophe, and then what I want to do is cd into our dating app -spar, and then we can run ngserve, which is going to build and run our Angular application. And once this is running, it's going to run on localhost 4200. So if we go and take a look at what we get, and I'll just copy that link and paste it into my browser, then what we get is the default Angular page saying welcome to app, and remember app is what we changed that property to, where it said title and interpolation has meant it's now displaying app. And we just see the contents of the page. It's pretty basic. But if I take a look and inspect so that I can get into Chrome Developer Tools, then what we can see inside this page is we actually have 5 JavaScript files injected into our index.html file. And this is our Angular application. And we've got our main, vendor, styles, polyfills, runtime, all injected into our index.html page to give us this view. And also, even though we write all of our code in TypeScript, this is always compiled into JavaScript because browsers do not understand TypeScript, and they only understand JavaScript. So our code gets compiled from TypeScript to JavaScript and then injected into this particular page. So now we have this particular page working. What we'll do is we'll try and do something useful, and we'll pull back those values from our API and display them on our page. And we'll start to take a look at that next.